We'll also tell you why it's a shipwreck, a transgender, like sexual reassignment surgery is a shipwreck for your emotional health, because 10 years after sexual reassignment surgery, your suicide rate goes to 20 times higher than the general population.
Join me, Jesse Romero, this September for a course on the Christian faith and demonology. That's what it's called. The Christian faith and demonology. The magisterial document put out by the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This next course in the Holy League Institute's online Catholic Spiritual Warfare School that I will be teaching, just want to remind you, we're back on duty. This course, Christian faith and demonology, will be rooted in a document put out by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is rooted in sacred scripture, sacred tradition. This formation equips everyday lay Catholics to understand the reality of the demonic, the victory that we have in Christ, and how the authentic Catholic faith fortifies us against the powers of darkness. As with my prior Holy League courses on angels and demons, original sin and temptation, and related topics, you'll receive clear, no compromise Catholic instruction designed to form strong students who become bold teachers and warriors for Christ and His church. We've got to do this for our families, for our parishes, and beyond. So register now. Go to theholyleagueinstitute.com, sign up, and become a holier, bolder soldier of Christ for my September course called Christian Faith and Demonology, a document put out by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. God bless you. Keep the faith. We'll see you in September.
Schools, probably not, but a lot of kids are. And the only way they're going to learn what's being left out of the answer and how the answer is skewed is if they have another AI they can ask the question of. So Magus AI fills it in. We made it because it does the intellectual work. So if you ask ChatGPT, will a fourth level multiverse discount God? You're going to get a Weasley answer. But if you ask Magus AI, will a fourth level multiverse rule out God? It's going to give you a very good Catholic answer, and with a lot of good scientific evidence. Good peer-reviewed scientific evidence, so you can back up your claim and you can access all the footnotes in the answer. So this is not like, throw some resources in at the end. The footnotes are there in the answer, and you'll be able to access them in Magus AI 2.0. And we'll have a wake word. Again, this is free of charge. We'll have a wake word. It's coming out September 15th. And all you have to say is, hey, Magus, and then ask your question. Like, how do I start a Catholic spiritual life? Or why does the church teach such negative things about transgenderism? Or, why, does the church teach things about homosexual lifestyle? Why is abortion truly wrong from a scientific perspective? I don't care what you ask it. It's going to give you a super good Catholic answer and a super good scientific answer. It's reasonable, it's responsible, and you just compare that to the ChatGPT answer. I rest my case. The whole rationale is to give a counterpoint AI that can show these kids, errors of omission are much harder to detect than errors of commission. So somebody lies, you can see it sometimes very evidently. But if somebody leaves out all the important material about God or religion in an answer that concerns God and religion, you can't tell because you don't know what you don't know until you've discovered it. So the basic thing is we want these kids to see that they've got an alternative. They look at Magus AI and they go, whoa, look at all this stuff that got left out of chat. Look at all the sources, the good scientific sources and the good social scientific sources. So if you want to know, well, what's wrong with transgenderism, we can tell you from the Catholic perspective, and do tell you that. We'll also tell you why it's a shipwreck. A transgender, like sexual reassignment surgery, is a shipwreck for your emotional health, because 10 years after sexual reassignment surgery, your suicide rate goes to 20 times higher than the general population, and your mortality rate goes 3 times higher than the general population, just by starting gender-affirming care, which is receiving hormones of the opposite of your biological sex. So you want all that information? Just go to Magus AI. It's all free. And like I said, on September 15th, we'll have my source library there too, with 2,000 pages of free articles. And we'll also have on the same website, this wake word where you can just ask orally and it will answer audibly starting on September the 15th. And a variety of other new features. You can enter this, free and anonymously. You can, if you enter free and you register with your email, then you can get a lot of extra benefits. And if you want to get some premium benefits, right, so you want like unlimited queries, and you want a lot of, like, we've got these rooms on Magus AI 2.0, which, as I said, comes out September 15th. So if you go into the Shroud room, for example, there's a chat box to your right, and you basically can ask a question, and you'll see the Shroud there, and there will be a yellow arrow, right? So as you say, well, maybe what is the evidence for the resurrection on the Shroud of Turin? Then as the chat is coming out, is answering the question for you, it's also pointing out on the actual shroud with a yellow arrow. It's showing you, how the image was made and where the image was and why it has to be radiation, and how in order to get that particle radiation coming out of the body, it would require a fissioning process, but a fissioning process requires a whole lot of energy, which is not in a limestone tomb or in a cloth, a linen cloth, or in a body. And so you're going to have a supernaturally caused particle radiation emanating from the body that's literally emanating 2 times 10 to the 19th, more or less, particles, neutrons and protons and deuterons coming out of the body. Now, that's not very much. That's just 1/10 billionth of the particles in a Jesus-sized 5'10" human body, right? So essentially, you can see this is going to have a supernatural cause. And also, you can see the evidence for why the body has to disappear. So it'll point to the dynamics. For example, the bloodstains on the shroud are nearly perfect bloodstains. There's no fragmenting, no segmenting, no smearing at all on these bloodstains. So, how do you get that from a body where 3/4 of the blood was already dried on the skin, right, when that body was transported to the tomb and laid in the shroud? 3/4 of the blood was already substantially dried. Well, it's not going to transport perfectly to the cloth at that stage. So how does it get there? Well, it gets there from radiation pressure. So again, it's the particle radiation that's building up between the skin and the blood on the skin. The particles are coming out of the body, and it builds up to such a point where suddenly, 2 times, well, let's just say 2/10 of a, between 1/10,000th of a second to 2/10,000ths of a second after this fissioning process begins, whap, right? The bloodstains are going to just get so much radiation pressure that they blast right onto the cloth. Now, when they blast onto that cloth, it's going to heat up the blood. And that means that when it heats it up, it's going to become liquidy again. So if that body stays inside the cloth, and the cloth with the heated up blood attaches to the body again, why, it's going to stick to both the body and the cloth. If you tried to remove the cloth from the body, you'd cause all kinds of fragmenting and smearing and segmenting. They would be very imperfect bloodstains. But the bloodstains we have on the cloth are perfect, including the contraction halos, and the edges of the bloodstains are actually perfect as well. So no mechanical means was used. Nobody could have pulled that cloth off the body, meaning that the body had to disappear between 1/10,000th of a second to 2/10,000ths of a second after the bloodstains got pushed onto the cloth perfectly. The body has to disappear. Now, of course, you probably have heard of the first law of thermodynamics. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. Well, there you have it. How in the world does the body disappear? We know from the Gospels it reappears in a transphysical form outside the tomb, but how did it disappear in the first place? And we have very good evidence that it disappeared as a whole, didn't leave a trace, while that, 1 to 2/10,000ths of a second after the blood was transferred. That is another miracle. It's got to be supernatural causation because it moves around, the first law of thermodynamics. So when you start putting this evidence together, you can actually see the yellow arrow can point out the various things on the shroud. Each blood stain can be explained. So on the back or the front of the shroud. So you can go into that room and you can get one free room for, if you do it free and anonymous. But if you do it free and you put your email in, you can get all of our rooms. We have a shroud room, a Eucharistic miracle room, or again, you can see the various pictures of the hosts, and the yellow arrow will show you what's being explained to you in the chat box there. And then we'll also have a Tilma of Guadalupe room. Again, we have little labs for each room. So we'll have, for the shroud room, a dating lab, a bloodstain lab, a resurrection lab, image formation lab, etc. Then we'll also have.
Let me ask you a question here. With all this, you are the master at showing that faith and reason are compatible. They're not incompatible. To me, how is it that people such as, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, Michael Newdow, and to a lesser extent, I mentioned Stephen Hawking. You debated him. How can these new atheists claim that science and faith are incompatible? Do they refuse to look at the evidence that we have? Do they just have a prejudice against people of faith? I mean, what's the fundamental category error that these people make, like Stephen Hawking, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Michael Newdow? What blinds them from the scientific data that points to the existence of a supernatural being we call God?
Well, just a quick clarification. Stephen Hawking did turn around and changed his agnosticism and to an implicit theism based on science. In 2018, he published an article called a smooth exit from eternal inflation. And in that article basically implied that if there were a multiverse, it would have to be finite and have a very small number of bubble universes, which means that the fine-tuning for life in our universe can only really be realistically explained by a transcendent intelligence. So he really made a turnaround and kind of joined the theism team, certainly implicitly, if not almost explicitly. Richard Dawkins didn't come full round, but he gave up his new atheism position, and about 6-7 years ago declared in a debate that he was no longer an atheist but an agnostic. And he indicated that his curiosity had trumped his skepticism based on the new scientific evidence. So those two guys did come around. And Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking are the two real scientists among the people that you mentioned. Now, there's some other people there, like Sam Harris and so forth. These would, and Hitchens certainly, again, more of, I would call, a liberal arts type atheist, if I can call it that way, and not particularly a scientific one, or really even a philosophical one when you get down to it. But they oftentimes have emotional arguments and straw man arguments that a lot of people have really refuted successfully. I mean, I wrote a book with a co-author basically indicating, many of the Sam Harris arguments regarding the scriptures, that just, they're so out of step with contemporary exegetical, historical exegesis, that's been going on since the third quest for the historical Jesus. I mean, sometimes you got to read a book or two from somebody who really knows and has given their life to historical exegesis before you make these outlandish claims about the lack of evidence or contradictions in the scripture. I mean, so a lot of these guys really, I think they have other alternative motives for atheism. I mean, the biggest reason for atheism is not an intellectual. You can't disprove the existence of God. You can't do it by science, and you can't do it by any method. I mean, look, if you're going to disprove the existence of God by science, listen to every scientific, premise one, every scientific argument has to be grounded in observational data. Must be. It's a canon of science. Number two, all observational data has to come from within what we call our event horizon in this universe. God, by definition, if you're going to consider God an unrestricted, uncaused, unique creator being, God has to be outside, beyond our universe. How can you disprove a God which is perfect being outside of our universe? How can you disprove that God with evidence that comes exclusively from within our universe? Answer: by the canons and the methodology of science, it is impossible. So that's the first thing to note. Science is never going to disprove God, and any scientist who says that it can knows he's violating the canons and method of his own discipline. So that's the first thing that's got to be recognized. Second thing that's got to be recognized is that, there's no method that you can use to disprove God. I mean, we only have three methods to disprove anything. We have, of course, a contradiction of fact. We have a contradiction of experience, or a contradiction of fact. And we also have what's called an intrinsic contradiction. So let's just test out these three methods with respect to our definition of God: an uncaused, unrestricted, unique creator of all else that is. Okay, let's take the first one. Are you going to use an empirical method to disprove God? Are you going to use your senses to disprove God? Of course not, because then you would have to sense everything that there was to sense, not only in our universe, but beyond our universe, which of course you don't even know about, because sensation can only happen within the observational event horizon in our universe. So, of course, you couldn't possibly use sensorial evidence to disprove God, because you can't sense everything there is to sense and notice that he's not there. That's out of the question. Can't even disprove unicorns that way. Number two, you can use intrinsic contradiction, but how are you going to say that being through itself is a contradiction with being? Being itself can't contradict being. So it's never going, right? That's what we mean by the first premise of any metaphysical proof, is that you have to have at least one uncaused reality. And an uncaused reality has to exist through itself, or what Thomas Aquinas would call being itself. Being itself won't contradict being, so you're never going to get an intrinsic formal argument to disprove God that way. Well, how about contradiction of a fact in the world? How about something like that? That God contradicts physics, or God contradicts, I don't know, sea monsters, God contradicts whatever in the world. Well, in order to get a contradiction, Jesse, guess what? You have to have some finitude. You've got to have a restriction, because it's the restriction of square that excludes the restriction of circle. In other words, 4 inscribed angles versus no inscribed angles, right? The circle excludes square of the same area in the same respect at the same place and time. The problem is it's the restrictions of the square that exclude, not the being of a square object. That's not what causes a contradiction. It's like the restrictions of a proton's activity exclude the restrictions of an electron's activity. You can't have a particle, for example, that can attract something to itself and repel something from itself in the same magnitude, in the same respect, at the same place and time. You can't have a proton-electron. Impossible, because those restrictions are contradictory. Now, you look at that for a second. How about an unrestricted entity? Remember, every uncaused reality has to be unrestricted, and there's a very good proof for that. Just ask Magus AI, and you'll get the answer. But the quick thing to say is, if every uncaused reality has to be unrestricted, then of course, you can't contradict something without any restrictions at all, can never enter into a contradiction with anything. If you don't have any finitude or restrictions, you can't contradict anything. So you can't disprove God by any method at all. It's impossible. You cannot disprove God rationally. And anybody who says that they can do it, I can prove that this is not a rational argument, but somebody has stuck some emotive fallacy or some informal fallacy into that disproof, or some equivocation that can be easily disproved. Show me from one of the people you mentioned, show me one disproof of God that actually works by formal methods of an empirical disproof, or a intrinsic contradiction, or a contradiction of fact. Show me one. And of course, there aren't any, because it can't be done unless you define God in some way that is not an uncaused, unrestricted, unique creator of everything else that is. So,
what you just said, I've heard it also put another way by a good Catholic philosopher. He said that atheism cannot be proven because the laws of logic tell us that you can't prove a universal negative. In other words, to prove that there's no God, that's impossible, like you said, because you'd have to examine every square inch of the universe. That means that you have to
beyond it.
Yeah, and beyond it. That means that you have to be omnipresent to be everywhere. Yep. You'd also have to know everything about every part of the universe at the same time. So you'd have to be omniscient, know everything. And you'd have to look under every rock, under every black hole, every crater, every galaxy, every square inch. So it's impossible. It's to disprove that there's a God, because we don't have, as human beings, we don't have the capacity to even investigate that with our limited, right?
Yeah. Right. Plus, God's not subject to a contradiction intrinsically, and God's not subject to a contradiction of fact because he's unrestricted. So, you're out of luck. There isn't any method where you can disprove God. And Magus AI can answer that question for you as well, if you want the written text, just so you can see the formal disproof of any disproof of God.
Father, here's a big question. I know we got about 10, 15 minutes more, but here's the big, I remember here's where they get a lot of Catholic kids. I think I've read something like 92 to 94% of Catholic kids, maybe even 96, go to public schools across the 50 states. So very few Catholics actually go to Catholic school. So most Catholic kids are taken to a public school, which, these days they have a Marxist orientation, a DEI orientation, and secular humanist orientation. Now, here's what they do in public schools. During the science class, they'll always have a big wall chart, and it'll say human evolution, the current tree. Then they'll show, the way Homo sapiens have developed or evolved from, little specimens to small ape-like creatures to Homo sapiens. They got a wall chart. They'll tell you, oh, this is, Australopithecus, and this is
Australopithecus.
Homo habilis, Peking man. This is Nebraska man. And these charts. So you're an impressionable young kid. You're like, I thought we came from Adam and Eve and God. But look at these charts on the wall. And our science teacher, he's very smart because my mom and dad are sending me to this school. And so have those charts, Lucy, Nebraska man, Piltdown man, Neanderthal man, Cro-Magnon man. Is this a fact or is this propaganda? And has it been debunked?
Well, no, it hasn't been debunked. And, obviously Pope Pius XII and St. John Paul II gave, organic evolution, at least a theoretical pass, and said, definitely that Catholics could believe in evolution in terms of just the physical process involved. But to know what a human being